President Cyril Ramaphosa has once again raised his voice against men who abuse women and children as the country observes the annual 16 Days of Activism for no violence against women and children. Acting in his capacity as leader of the ANC, President Ramaphosa launched the Raising a Boy-Child campaign in Durban. This was on Saturday, whose aim is to instill respect for women while at the same time developing young boys into model citizens. But critics say the political leadership in South Africa lacks sincerity, particularly towards its citizens, as it is showing more energy to resolving other nations' problems while its backyard is collapsing. One such critic is Maimane, who is the leader of Build One South Africa. He joins me alongside OUTA's head of legal, Stefanie Fick. To both of you, thank you so much for making time for this discussion. Mr. Maimane, I want to start off with you. When you suggest what you are, that South African leaders are eager to impress the world while their backyard is collapsing, let's use the example of the annual observance of the 16 days of activism for no violence against women and children. The government will argue that there is a national strategic plan that is trying to address issues of GBV and femicide, and that has just been announced to also be funded. So they will say this is what we are doing to address the problems of the country. But here you are, you're saying that no, it's not quite as it seems. Please explain.
Good morning, Xoli, and good morning to fellow South Africans. First and foremost, I think what's important to assess government is not what pronouncements they make. They will make a pronouncement every week. The truth is, let's look at the scoreboard. When you look at violence against women and children, those numbers are rising. When you look at violent contact crime in South Africa, in the last, from 2012, you can conclude the fact that the number has gone up by 77%. And frankly, what we're seeing now all over is the fact that when you assess even employment statistics, you discover very quickly that 2 out of 3 young people are battling to find work. So in truth, we're living in a country where, as many reports are starting to indicate, conditions for black South Africans are no different in many ways than those of homelands, as the Harvard report indicates. So to me, I must concede that we are running a government that governs as though black lives don't matter. And my ultimate conclusion is the fact that we have a government that is committed to thinking that one policy failure must be remedied by introducing a new one, whilst in fact it is doing very little to do significant change on this issue. So I hate to say it, Xoli, but in all truth, we may not have state failure yet, but we have a government failure, and therefore any pronouncement that government is making is simply of no consequence.
Stefanie Fick, let's come to you. If we use, again, the very example I highlighted to Mr. Maimane, and that is that the 16 days of no violence against women and children, or to be more specific, the National Strategic Plan, government will say that that has now been bolstered by government. There is now going to be funding for that. Do you agree with Mr. Maimane that talking is one thing, but the actual action is what matters most?
Yeah, no, of course. I would like to hear a view different to that. I think the people of South Africa need to feel the change and not just hear the change. I mean, let's compare that to the dialogue that's been going on about corruption. So are they as serious, as they were about, corruption, having a national dialogue about that, instituting all kinds of meetings, civil society coming together, is it going to go down the same path? Because we know, to what extent corruption has been eradicated. So unfortunately, let's congratulate them on the fact that at least, we are talking about it. But that's not where it ends. And one has to question why now. This has been a problem for a while. And I do think we also need to address the fact that violence against women and children is not a one-faceted problem. There's various layers to it. And it's good to know that resources are going to be thrown into this idea. But are we going to look at the NPA? Are we going to look at, the police ability to prosecute? Are we going to also give resources in those areas? Because without it, you can talk as much as you want. Education, and all of that. So again, I have to agree with Mmusi that we need to see some action now.
Let's come back to you, Mmusi, because you have already referenced the Harvard study. And you've brought out, or you've singled out, two primary issues there that you are saying are the cause of malaise in South Africa. One, it is the collapsing state capacity, but second of all, it is the spatial exclusion. Let's start with the latter, because you are saying that what this study basically deduces is that black South Africans remain trapped in crime-ridden townships and government does not seem to have the capacity to fix it. So, what new questions arise out of this conclusion?
Well, what's absolutely vital is that when you look at spatial development in the country, it is clear to me that we've even failed the basic exercise of investing in townships. Let me use a very simple example. There's a tourist that gets attacked in Nyanga, which you do not want ever happening in this country. The government's actual response to the issue is that it in fact decides that it is going to rather move Nyanga as a route out of Google rather than dealing with crime in Nyanga. So the ultimate consequence of what's going on in South Africa is the fact that for too many people in our nation, crime has locked them in circumstances that they cannot control with a government that doesn't respond. That's why I've proposed that there must be better investment in township policing, that we must bring it down to a level upon which we can have increased visibility and a priority in terms of capacitation of police stations. But they're not going to do that. Instead, what we see more and more of is that when it comes to global and geopolitical issues, where was Parliament meeting to discuss the murder rate in this country? Instead, we can pass a resolution on a very important issue, no doubt, of the Israel-Palestine conflict that is taking place, or the Russia-Ukraine one, that we can deploy the president. And all of these, Parliament meets immediately. But when there's a crisis of employment, when there's a crisis of healthcare, when there's all of these crises, we have a government that is slow to move and its capacity has failed. In truth, our biggest dilemma that we face, to the first point that you make, is the fact that unless next year we begin to appoint ethical leadership that is able to come and build state capacity and institutionalism, and President Ramaphosa has not only fixed the state, he's in fact made it bigger and made a super presidency instead of creating capacity for the state to actually do policy work. It's an indicator of the fact that the trajectory of state ability to deliver is becoming weaker and weaker.
Stefanie, let's come to you. If we use the exact same example of crime-ridden townships, the Premier of Gauteng, Panyaza Lesufi, is going to say, but this is exactly what my crime wardens are trying to address, or at least are supposed to address, because up until they are legally authorized to be on the streets and police those townships, they as good as non-existent. Is that at least a fair attempt by government to try and address the issue of crime in the townships?
I think it's, again, a step in the right direction. But is it the complete solution to the problem? No. I think if we just look at the situation, it doesn't help you have law enforcement if you do not have the ability to prosecute them. So the two go hand in hand. And then what are you going to do about the infrastructure? What are you going to do about the economy? So I do agree that, we need more policing. I think everybody will agree, and more so in the townships where people are on a daily basis go through horrible experiences. But that's not the only thing. What it seems that Premier Lesufi has done is take the money. You know where he took the money from? NGOs. the NGOs that, in my view, has got an extremely important job to do because of government's failure to do it, to look after children, just for example. So you can't find just one way of an enormous problem. And again, step in the right direction. But if you do not fix, just for example, the ability of people to have a job in order to look after their families, I think you can deploy as many policemen that may or may not, create a better environment, but will it fix the problem?
Mmusi, another point you raise in your opinion piece is that of countless children in South Africa who are dying because of hunger, and that can no longer be denied in the Eastern Cape. That matter has become so prevalent that some parents are turning to killing themselves and their children because they can no longer bear the sight of hunger when they look at their children, because they don't know where to look to find food. Why has government failed here?
Probably part of the developmental plan that this country needs to put on the table is how do we look after the child in utero and all the way through to the early first 1,000 days of their lives. And in all reality, what we've done is we've created these ministries called the Ministry of Women, Children, and People with Disabilities. And when you look at the historical legacy of ministers there haven't been people who you could simply say not only understand what development looks like, but more crucially, are able to deliver and execute against it. So I have proposed that as a principal thing, we need to have a form of maternal grant or maternal support for women who are pregnant. Because at this point in time, the rate of stunting for children is increasing, and most recent research indicates the fact that children's economic potential in this country is now sitting below 50%. So in other words, for every child that is born in this country, their probability of economic prosperity has halved. So when you then take that and then you add to the fact that in the first 1,000 days of a child's life, if they are hungry, their brain development is significantly impaired, you are in fact creating a child that regardless of any education interventions you put on the table, their capacity to be able to develop is significantly stunted. So our proposal again is to simply say, if you had a capable state and a minister who understood part of this problem, we would have by now started to think how we can zero rate certain items so that mothers are able to feed their kids at a lesser rate. Because at this point in time, the most stolen item, you go to any Pick and Pay and you look at the security that they put around child formula. It is a stolen item. It should be a shame upon all of us as a society that mothers are resorting to committing crime just to feed their kids. So, frankly, we need to be able to attend to that, or the next generation of kids will be worse off than this current one. And what shook me the most about that report, which prompted me to write the actual article, was that it simply said South Africa's dark and difficult days are ahead, not behind. And that is a deep concern. So, for me, unless we begin to attend to the issue of state capacity, appoint ministers and create the office of a child, as countries that are developing, such as Brazil, Chile, and many others have already established to ensure that the first 1,000 days of a child's life are well looked after, we are going to create a concept such as separate development, where if you've got money, your circumstances and your prospects for development are increased. But if you don't have money, which is largely black South Africans, I can assure you without a shadow of a doubt, we are creating circumstances upon which black people will continue to suffer even further than what we are seeing right now today. So I would urge that for every child in this country, regardless of race, we need a form of maternal grant and support. We need to be able to ensure their first 1,000 days are well looked after, capacitate ECD centers so that educational path is possible, and ultimately appoint leadership in government that is able to ensure that actually we can execute against policy. Yeah. Because to use a ministry like Women, Children, and People with Disabilities as kind of this parking off for women's league leaders who often half the time don't help in that circumstance is the very rock that creates incapacity within that department and harms children's future in this country.
Stefanie, we get to conclude with you, and on this score of malnutrition that is showing itself so prevalently in the Eastern Cape, I think what crowns all of this for me, and surely government cannot deny this, is that just last year, the Eastern Cape government forfeited 67 million rand, which was meant for food parcels, and this supposedly addresses, or at least is provided to 85,000 struggling households. I don't know if you had the opportunity, and I would really not want to mention another channel here, but it's important because of the good work that they do. I watched Carte Blanche yesterday. The story simply reduced me to tears. The story of malnutrition in the Eastern Cape. An HIV-positive mother had to resort to breastfeeding her child, even though the advice was, don't breastfeed because you might infect the child. And they both cried, you know. So I have to then conclude with you with this point that says, is Mmusi Maimane completely wrong then when he says that we have a bunch of politicians whose priority is focusing on other countries and what troubles those countries and the speed with which matters are resolved in Parliament versus what we are struggling with here and now in South Africa? Can you argue against that point?
No, and I'm going to go a step further by saying I think we are concentrating on the wrong things in general, not just now that we have international war and you know, I think internationally it's also not going well, is that just in general we are not focusing on the right stuff. I mean, it's horrible. It is horrible that in today's age we need to discuss the fact that we have hungry children. It is beyond me that we have to discuss it because it's that of a severe problem, while we look at an overinflated cabinet, for example, and Parliament not doing their job. The fact that just, you know, in the Durban harbour, you know, we can't offload stuff because of, you know, just historical leaders not being able to do what they are supposed to do. That ethical leadership that we need, the taking hands with, I think that's the only solution, for example, for Durban, taking hands with private sector who's got the skills, because we lost our skills. You know, they have to pay 28% more to get products in South Africa. Who is going to suffer? The end user that has to go to a shop and pay even more. And I want to reiterate that shouldn't we concentrate on creating more jobs instead of trying to convince people why next year it's still a good idea to vote for certain, you know, certain parties. And that the time for promising people grants, because, you know, as a political party, you're the only one that can provide that. Nonsense that comes from the state. But I'm still saying that, you know, a grant is one thing, and believe me, that's the only income some people have, and without it they will not survive. But isn't it time that we think about creating more jobs? We've talked about it so many times, but it really is time that we see the difference, and the difference you can create by enforcing certain policies.
Stefanie Fick from OUTA, thank you very much for your contribution to this discussion. And Mmusi Maimane, thank you very much for sparking the conversation.